Hey everybody, it's Sean here, and in today's video I want to give you guys a quick comparison between the 2022 Lost and Found or Chicago Reimagined ones versus the 2015 Chicago ones. So first things first, in terms of the overall height and shape of this shoe, to my surprise, the 2015 version is actually a little bit taller in height compared to the 2022 version. You can also see around that ankle collar area, the black portion at the very top. On the 2015 version, it stands up straighter and a little bit taller, whereas the 2022 version is a little bit more curved and rounded. But in terms of the heel slant or slope, the 2022 version is a little bit straighter overall on the heel compared to the 2015 version, which has a little bit more of a forward slant. And in terms of the toe box shape, I felt like the 2022 version had a little bit more of a nice gradual slope compared to the 2015 version, which had a little bit more of a curve at the very edge of the toe box. As far as materials go, on the toe box, you can see of course that the 2022 version is given that vintage look with that cracked sail colored leather, whereas for the 2015 version, it's much more of a smooth leather in white. But if you look real closely, the perforations are a little bit different. This year's version, the perforations I felt like were a little bit more pronounced and bigger, whereas the 2015s were a little bit smaller in comparison. As far as the red leather goes, comparing the two in terms of shade of color, I feel like the 2015 version is a bit more vibrant and bold, whereas the 2022 version is a little bit more faded and a little bit more muted. And in terms of the finish of the leather, the 2015 version has a little bit more gloss, whereas this year's version looked a little bit more matte in comparison. And in terms of the side panels of this shoe, same goes as the toe box. So this year's version has that cracked and sail color to it, whereas the 2015 version is much more of a true and classic white. And as far as the black swooshes go, I felt like they were pretty identical. I didn't really notice any differences from a material or a texture standpoint, and at least to my naked eye, it felt pretty identical. Next up, the Wings logo on the lateral side, these were pretty different. So the 2015 version is much more of your classic Wings logo, where it's debossed into the red leather and then it's painted on top, given a shiny black finish. And in comparison, this year's version is much more like the OG look or the 85 look, where it's embossed instead of debossed, and it's painted in a matte black finish. At the very top of this ankle collar area, the materials here are very different. So the black leather used on the 2015 version, you can see it's given this artificial dimpled look, so it's much more of a synthetic feeling leather. Whereas this year's version has that cracked appearance, and I don't know if this is just due to the age of the 2015 version, but this year's feels a little bit softer and it feels more plush to the touch. The tongues are also a very obvious difference as well. 2015's uses a classic white nylon, whereas this year's gives it more of that vintage touch with this orange or reddish tone to it. And then at the very top, the tags are very different too. While they're both done in red and white, the font on this year's version is a little bit thinner, and you can see we have the R for registered next to Nike and the swoosh. The inner liners of the shoe are also very different too. 2015's is constructed in much more of a classic mesh. It has these larger holes on it, whereas this year's version is much more tightly wound and has much more of a smoother and silkier feel to it to the touch. And as far as the insoles go, so this year's version, these come with a polyurethane insole, whereas the 2015 version is much more of your classic foam. So I'd say that it's a clear upgrade for this year's version. And this isn't based on any science or any measurements or anything like that, but at least to the touch, the red leather on this year's version feels a little bit thicker compared to the 2015s. Maybe that's just because the 2015s are an older shoe and because they're worn, but just from the eye test, the leather looks a little bit thicker and it feels a little bit stiffer too. In terms of the midsoles, so I feel like they're pretty identical. The height on the midsole and the overall shape is pretty much spot on, as well as the pattern that's found on the rubber itself. But the obvious difference is of course that this year's version is given that sail look to it, whereas the 2015 version is left in a pure white. And then last but not least, the outsoles, I feel like they're pretty much the same. This year's version has that vintage wash to it, and if I'm nitpicking, if anything, I feel like maybe the stars on this year's version run a little bit deeper and they're a little bit more pronounced than the 2015s. So I'm pretty sure that covers the differences from an appearance standpoint and from a material standpoint. But from an overall sizing and fit perspective, again, I don't know if that's because this year's version is brand new and the 2015 version I've worn many times. So take this with a grain of salt, but I feel like the 2015 version runs a little bit wider, it feels a little bit more wide foot friendly, whereas this year's version, it fits a little bit more like the 85 cut ones, like the natural gray or neutral grays, or the Georgetown ones. So both pairs, I got these in the exact same size. I'd recommend most people to stick true to size for either pair, but maybe it's a combination of the slightly thicker leather and the fact that it's brand new, but I felt like it was a little bit more snug around this midfoot and toe box area. But it wasn't snug enough that I'd want to go up a half size, so simply put, stick with your normal Jordan 1 size for the lost and founds as well. So I think that pretty much covers all the differences that I noticed between the two versions. I think the biggest thing is, of course, the overall shape. It's a little bit taller on the 2015 version, but the materials on this year's version feels a little bit thicker and a little bit stiffer as well. And of course, the vintage coloring on this year's version compared to, of course, the classic coloring on the 2015s. But as you can see, they're pretty similar, so if you couldn't get a pair of the 2015s, then you can definitely try your luck to grab this year's version when they drop later on this year in November. Between the two though, I gotta give the edge to the 2015s. I just think it looks more like your classic true Chicago 1s without those extra bells and whistles, but hey, that's just my personal opinion. My train of thought is when I'm opening up my closet and I see both of these side by side, 99% of the time I'm gonna reach for this one compared to this one, which I feel like, yeah, it's cool, but this isn't the classic Chicago 1 that I grew up idolizing when I started collecting sneakers over a decade and a half ago. Maybe that's more of an old school mentality where I like my shoes to look brand new, but everyone has their own opinion and there's no right or wrong answer. So let me know in the comment section down below. Between the two, the 2015 version right here versus the 2022 version right here, which of the two do you guys prefer? Do you like more of the vintage aged look of this year's versus the classic look of the 2015? Drop a comment down below. I'm curious to know which of the two versions you guys prefer. If you guys like this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. You can follow me on Instagram at esco8, check me out on Twitter at sean.go, and visit my website at seango.ca. So until next time, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully I helped you in some way, and I'll catch you guys all in my next review.